Shell chords are really useful, especially if you are learning to play jazz piano. They're also cool in other genres which have a lot in common with jazz, so funk, R&B to an extent, but fundamentally they're a jazz skill and they're great for making your life easier. Let me show you how. Imagine you've got a fairly simple chord sequence. C major 7, A minor 7, F major 7, G7, very typical kind of, almost a cliche of a jazz chord progression. Okay, let's play that with a very simple improvised right hand. Although that doesn't sound too bad, there are a couple of little problems going on there. First of all, moving all three fingers and a thumb down and up actually takes a fair amount of mental effort to make sure everything lands in the right place. Okay, it's not a problem if you're taking it fairly slowly, like we were then, but if things started to get quicker, okay, suddenly you're using quite a lot of brain power to make sure all your fingers land in the right place. Secondly, and more importantly, and this kind of depends on the instrument you play, but it's true of all pianos to a certain extent, playing full chords in the left hand can sound quite muddy and dark. It's not too bad here, but when you get down to here, okay, it's quite difficult to distinguish the individual notes. It sounds like a bit of a mess, and it can detract from what you're doing in the right hand. So using a shell chord solves both those problems because it takes out two of the notes of the four-note chord. Okay, and instead of playing root, third, fifth, and seventh, we just play the root and the seventh of each chord. Okay, so our C major 7, A minor 7, F major 7, G7 becomes something like this. Okay, so can you hear that's a much more clear ringing sound than having the other notes in there? But because you've got the two most important notes of the chord that really give it its character, the root and the seventh, whether that's a major seventh or a minor seventh, you still get the kind of character of the chord. The other thing you can do with shell chords to vary is, rather than playing the root and the seventh, is to play the root and the third, just for a bit of variation. Okay, just play around with it. That's as complicated as shell chords get. The thing to do is just understand that you can use them and how to use them in that very simple way, and go away and play around with them for yourself. They do make life quite a lot easier if you just give them a little bit of practice and you know, try and incorporate them in your playing as and when you can. Anything else to say about shells? No, I don't think so. That's really how simple they are. Oh yeah, one thing that's worth mentioning is sometimes if you get a more complex chord, it can be more difficult to render as a shell chord. So say for example you get something like B diminished seventh. Okay, you can play the root and the seventh and it'll work, though it can be a little bit ambiguous. Okay, because it can begin to sound like an A flat minor chord. The trickiest ones of all are when you get augmented chords. Okay, they don't have a seventh, obviously they're based on major thirds, so the safest thing to do there is to play the root and the augmented fifth. Okay, but they're fairly rare, and you know, it's not that big of a deal if you don't play them exactly perfectly every time. Okay, so there we are. That's all there is to say about shell chords. Use your root and your seventh, or occasionally your root and your third, and it saves those horrible big muddy dominant chords down the bottom. Okay, there we go.